those rich people, always flying off somewhere.
Welcome to the Vegan Vanguard, a show about all things from the perspective of two revolutionary vegan women. I'm Maureen.
And I'm Laura.
Oh, we have a guest today. So, this is a little plot twist. Today, Mexi is not here, and Laura is kindly joining me for a discussion about vegan washing of Israel, about the situation with Israel and Palestine, and notably what we're going to be talking about is a vegan fest that happened in Israel called Vibe Vegan, where they invited 4 very prominent bloggers from the vegan world to discover Israel as like a culinary plant-based heaven. And so I thought that this would be a really great time to talk to Laura because she is a real encyclopedia when it comes to discussing everything in relationship to Israel and their occupation and Palestine, and notably vegan washing. So for any longtime subscribers of my channel, you might recognize Laura because we did an interview together called Israel and Palestine, an overview, vegan washing, BDS, and more. And now she's back. Now we're talking again today. So I'm super excited. Let me introduce Laura quickly. So Laura Schleifer is a pro-intersectional vegan activist, Palestinian solidarity activist, theater artist, and educator. Laura has been vegan for 5 years and a Palestinian solidarity activist for 10 years. Notably, Laura taught a course at Wesleyan Green Street Art Center on a 3,000-year history of Palestine, Israel, and the Middle East. She also spoke at UK VegFest Brighton with me. I mean, not with me, but we were both speakers at the Pro-Intersectional Conference, which was really wonderful. Her talk was called The Animal Have the Answers. Laura, do you want to tell us a little bit about that talk?
Yeah, so basically, well, it was very interesting because at the Brighton Veg Fest that year, it was Christopher Sebastian McJetters who was organizing what they called the Intersectional Summit. And so that had a theme, and the theme was on the crisis of capitalism and neoliberalism and the rise of white nationalism and fascism in its place. And this question of what response, first of all, the animal liberation and vegan movement could have for that, and what might be the right direction for the West to take in the aftermath of those systems collapsing. So actually, it was very interesting how I came up with the concept behind my talk for that, because I was really just kind of interested in a lot of things relating to trying to find a better system. And I happened to be looking into anarchism and specifically anarcho-communism. The Western incarnation of that was founded by Peter Kropotkin. And so I was watching a documentary on Peter Kropotkin. I knew nothing about him at that stage, really. And then right in the middle of the documentary, they started showing footage of ants. And it turned out that Kropotkin had come up with his theories of anarcho-communism from studying, among other things, animal societies. Basically, he studied all different types of animals, all different species, insects, birds, mammals, obviously, crabs, cetaceans, all different types of animals. And basically, he found the same patterns in nature over and over and over again, that basically animals had societies where there really wasn't any sort of positions of hierarchy, where they worked together collaboratively, and where everything was based on mutual aid, that basically they knew. And it was very interesting because he said, Darwin talks about this in his writings as well, but they were misinterpreted, that people thought that he was talking about the survival of the fittest as in one individual being the fittest or the smartest or the strongest or the fastest or whatever, that being the one that would survive. But actually what he found was that that's not how nature works at all. It's that the community that is the strongest is the one that survives.
Mm-hmm.
So the individuals work together, help each other, and collaborate, and they are the ones who survive. So from that, he said that's really the way that humanity is meant to be living. We're meant to be living in communal situations where we're not competing against each other, but we're working together and helping each other, and that is the way that humans are meant to live. And in fact, that is the way that humans did live for most of their history, and the way that indigenous communities have always lived, those that have not been completely had their way of life destroyed by colonialism still live today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so he wrote a book, a very interesting book called Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, that talks about this theory. And from that, I thought, my God, how perfect that coming
Mm-hmm.
to this conference to talk about the animal liberation movement's ideas for how to build a better society. And here we have a theory about building a better society that is based on how animals live. So that's actually how I came up with the talk, and that was the theme.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've been thinking a lot about this idea of how competition is like the trope that governs our life, and how we think that it's what has made us great as human societies and what has led us to be able to pursue progress, when that indeed really isn't true.
Yeah, absolutely not. It's the complete opposite, really. It's hindered progress in a lot of ways.
And you also spoke at the Collectively Free conference in New York City at Hunter College. It was called Bloodied Bodies, Slaughtered Souls, and that talk focused on the conditions of slaughterhouse workers and the intersection between human oppression and animal oppression.
Yeah. And actually, I do want to add a little something about that one because, as I was doing the research for that talk, I found out that that issue was very, very heavily intertwined with the immigration issue, specifically Latin American immigrants, because actually 75% of US slaughterhouse workers are undocumented immigrants. But it's interesting because if I were going to give that talk again, I could actually go even deeper into that because, as it turns out, after the fact, I realized that, in fact, a lot of the reason why Latin Americans, and again, especially indigenous communities in Latin America, are getting pushed off their land in the first place and being forced into immigrating is the fact that multinational animal agriculture corporations are taking over their land for growing animal feed crops for export, for ranching, for raising animals and exporting their products. So there's like an unbelievable connection between those two issues, and of course a lot of other issues as well.
Yeah, that's very fascinating, and I feel like I could talk to you about so many of these topics for like an entire podcast episode each, which is what happens a lot of time when we talk on Skype. We end up talking for hours and hours about all of these different connections.
Yes.
An aspect that I really like to pursue in my veganism is figuring out the endless connections that there are between animal oppression and literally everything else that goes on. And I feel like you do the same, so it's been really wonderful to share that thought process with you. Throughout the years,
Yes.
So I did an interview with Laura on my channel. This is like maybe a year and a half ago now. I asked Laura how she first became involved in the Palestinian solidarity movement, especially as a Jewish American woman who wasn't particularly raised in a household where that was like a mainstream discussion. Right, Laura, would you say that that's correct?
Yeah, I mean, my family was not heavily Zionist. I was lucky in the sense that I didn't get the heavy duty brainwashing where that's concerned. But of course, we were Jewish. And so obviously, there's always a little bit of a feeling of, oh, well, they're the Jewish nation and we're Jewish. And so there's always that sense of, oh, there is some sort of connection there. But yeah, I was not heavily subjected to propaganda where that was concerned, the way that a lot of Jewish people are.
Mm-hmm. And you got more interested in the issue when you went to Israel on a trip that was just, oh no, it wasn't when you went to Israel, it was when you went to Palestine on a theater trip, correct?
Right. So what happened was actually I became a lot more interested in finding out really what was going on there with the Second Intifada, which happened just after 9/11. So at that point, I was really making a concerted effort to try to find out what was going on there. But I had no guidance. I did not know where to begin looking. Everything I was finding out was just completely out of context. I was totally confused. I knew there was a lot of propaganda. I didn't know on which side it was on, but I knew that there was, I just didn't know what to trust or who to believe. And I will say that I really was kind of always feeling, just even knowing like the barest minimum, I always felt in my heart like something rotten was going on there. And really, my sympathies were always more with Palestine because it just was such a, even if you only know the barest minimum of there used to be a country called Palestine and then it just became Israel. And then the Palestinians were really upset about that and they were continuing to have like suicide bomb attacks. That's basically the extent that I knew before I started, trying to delve more into it. I kept thinking to myself, they're upset for a reason. Their country was taken over. They're killing themselves because they feel like they have nothing to live for. So I always had this sense of, I don't really know what's going on over there. I don't understand it. But there was always this feeling of something is not quite right about what we're being told about this situation because it just doesn't seem kosher. So So I was very confused and lost. I will say one other thing about the way that I thought about this issue before I went there. I remember as a child, even that I would watch, like the news and they'd be talking about like UN meetings and whatnot. And there would always be Yasser Arafat. And of course, I always heard Yasser Arafat's a terrorist. Yasser Arafat's a terrorist. And then I would look at that even as a child and I would think to myself, well, if Yasser Arafat is a terrorist, then what is he doing speaking at the UN?
Yes.
Like arresting him and imprisoning him. He's a terrorist. And so I always had that sense of something is just not quite legitimate about what we're being told. But I really didn't know anything beyond that until I went there. And yeah, the way it ended up going was kind of random. It was fate because what actually happened was that originally I was very involved in protesting the sanctions on Iraq that the US was putting on Iraq prior to the 2003 invasion. And that was absolutely horrific. They basically intentionally stopped Iraq from being able to access food, medicine, clean water, which is exactly what Israel is doing to Gaza now. But they did that during that period, and 1.6 million Iraqis died, including 600,000 Iraqi children. And there was an organization called Voices in the Wilderness that was making trips to Iraq to witness what was going on there and then come back and expose Americans in the US to the situation there. And I was planning to go with them. And they also had kind of like an offshoot group that did circus and theater performances in Iraq. And by the time I was ready to go, the Iraq war had already started, and the group that was doing the circus trip said, oh, it's too dangerous for us to go to Iraq now, but we are going to Palestine. And so my reaction to that was kind of like, oh, Palestine. Oh. Because even though I was wanting to know more about what was going on there, obviously it was kind of awkward for me as a Jewish person and my Jewish family. And yeah, so I was kind of like, I don't really, I don't know how my family's going to react to that.
How did they react to that?
My mother is very apolitical where that's concerned, so she had no problem with it. The one I was concerned about was my father. Because to be honest, even though my father never subjected me to any sort of heavy propaganda, he definitely swung a little more on the liberal Zionist side of things. He's got like a picture in his office of an Israeli plane flying over like a concentration camp. In Europe to kind of symbolize, that Jews have risen from the ashes of that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely a little more on the liberal Zionist side. So I was concerned to tell him that I was thinking of going to Palestine. His main concern was my safety. It wasn't really the political situation. But yeah, I have had some conflict and, with some of my extended family as well, my aunts and uncles and stuff like that are much more heavily Zionist. But he did accept it. And then obviously it was hugely eye-opening for me. And that was in 2008. And I have been ever since then. I mean, that, was like interesting because when I actually saw what was going on there, it was so overwhelming to me, just so completely different than everything that I had ever heard about the situation that I really had to start researching it after I experienced it firsthand to make sense of what I had seen and experienced and what was exactly going on there. And it was really only pretty recently, only in the last couple of years that I felt like, okay, now I can actually really start talking about this and writing about this and feel like I know what I'm talking about, because it is, there's a lot of layers of misinformation and propaganda, which of course is kind of the whole point of this interview, is to talk about that.
Right. Yeah, you're very vocal about it, and you're one of the people who has taught me the most about the situation in Israel and Palestine. I related to a lot of what you said. I mean, obviously, I didn't grow up in, I'm not Jewish, and I just had kind of the mainstream. So I went to high school in France, and I had like the mainstream history course on the Middle East, and we spent like a month covering the Israel-Palestine conflict, if that.
Yeah.
It was very much presented to me as something that had two sides, that it was like this like thousands and thousands year old religious conflict that you could never really have a clear idea about, right, one way or another.
Total nonsense.
And I must say that it took me a really long time to sort of overcome that, this idea that like you can never speak about it because you're always undereducated, and there's always so many different sides that will invalidate your argument. I would say to this day, I mean, so I took a course in college by one of Edward Said's like disciples, a professor. I'm blanking on his name right now. Anyway, it was a really great course called The Modern Middle East, where I learned a good deal about the situation and the history. I made a video on my YouTube channel about it with Zavi, who's also a pro-Palestine activist. I've watched Occupation 101 like 2 or 3 times. I've spoken to you extensively. I was on Vegan Warrior Princess's Attack doing an episode about pink washing and vegan washing, and I still to this day have this almost inexplicable fear to talk about the conflict. I mean, I don't even like to call it a conflict because it's an occupation, and there's not, conflicts makes it seem like there's two sides to it when, there really is not two sides to this occupation. But I still I still feel undereducated in talking about it, and I try to overcome that and not let that, shut me up about the issue altogether. But another reason is, I've gotten so much flack and so much pushback every time I do talk about it. The video we did together has nearly 600 comments, and while a lot of them were positive, there was also a huge amount of pushback and hatred from it. And yeah, it's just very overwhelming, especially when anti-Zionism is conflated with anti-Semitism, and people make it seem like it's anti-Semitic to talk about the Israeli occupation.
Right.
Mexi and I, a few episodes back, did a whole episode on anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism in the vegan community, and we talked about, anti-Semitism is obviously a real thing. There's like a long history of it, and it's a problem both on the left and the right, and it's a problem both on the Zionist side and the anti-Zionist side and everything, but it shouldn't be conflated with the issue. It shouldn't keep us from talking about the active like colonizing occupation that is going on Palestinian land. And so I'm just so grateful that I have you to talk about this stuff with. And particularly, so this episode was inspired by somebody who reached out to me and who said, hey, have you heard of this vegan vibe tour? And that's been going on, these 4 bloggers. I'll talk a little bit more about the tour in a second. I just briefly want to kind of explain the situation with Vibe Israel and Vegan Vibe and Brand Israel as well. And, she said, I think it would be really great to talk about it because it's getting such a huge amount of reach in the vegan community. And
So terrible.
it's true that looking into it, I had not realized how much exposure this Vibe
Right.
Israel trip got. So just quickly, they invited 4 hugely popular food bloggers to spend a week in Israel. Caitlin Shoemaker, also known as From My Bowl on Instagram, who has 275,000 Instagram followers and 387,000 YouTube followers. Sweet Simple Vegan with 206,000 Instagram followers and 40,000 YouTube followers. The Buddhist Chef with nearly 50,000 Instagram followers, and Rebel Recipes with 211,000 Instagram followers. So this is, these are people with huge audiences. I only followed Caitlin Shoemaker's quite closely. She seems incredibly sweet and well-intentioned. I like her YouTube channel a lot. This is something Laura and I are going to talk about as well, is like how they're pulling in people who have nothing but, I think, good intentions and who are very uneducated about the conflict.
Yeah.
And that's what's scariest to me, is like, it looks so jovial and so positive and like such a project you want to support and want to believe in, and
Right.
at the end of the day is very successful at diffusing an image of Israel as a safe place for vegans, as a place where you can go and have just an abundance of options.
Yeah.
So to give a bit of context, Israel has for a long time been hailed in the vegan community.
Yeah.
An article published last year in The Independent reported Tel Aviv alone has over 400 vegan and vegetarian restaurants, and justifiably refers to itself as the plant-based capital of the world. So the article goes on to explain that Israel is particularly well suited as the vegan hub because of the unparalleled freshness of its produce, its communal markets, and its national staples, which include hummus and falafel, that are already vegan. A little bit more later on the cultural appropriation of talking about hummus and falafel as, Israelis' national food, because it's not.
Because Israel is 70 years old, and hummus and falafel are a lot older than that.
Right.
Yeah.
And they explain that in the past 6 years, the explosion of plant-based restaurants has transformed Israel's population of just 8 million into the largest vegan nation per capita in the world. The tourism ministry now promotes Israel as a vegan nation, and Tel Aviv is at the heart of the movement. So this was also very bolstered by Gary Yourofsky's presence in the movement. He, had the best speech you'll ever hear, I think, that video that went viral on YouTube. But he's also quoted as saying that Palestinians are some of the craziest people in the world, or no, the craziest people in the world, excuse me. That was too generous of me. And he's done a bunch of other pretty gross things that we talk about extensively in my YouTube video with Laura, so we're not going to spend too much time talking about Gary Yourofsky today. But anyhow, vegan washing is part of Brand Israel, a government-backed campaign to promote Israel as a cool, progressive, modern, and innovative cultural hub. It was launched as a response to decades of pro-Palestinian activism that denounced Israel as a settler colonial state founded on the genocide of Palestinian people, which maintains its power through a system of apartheid and violence against the Palestinian people. We'll talk about the connection between Vibe Israel and Brand Israel in a quick moment. Vibe Israel, by the way, is the NGO that sponsored the tour Vegan Vibe that these 4 very influential bloggers went on. And before I hand over the floor to Laura, I wanted to read you the promotional message of Vibe Israel, because it really could not be any clearer. I think I'll
It's
also...
pretty explicit.
It really is. Part of me thinks that the fact that they're so unabashed in disclosing their intentions, which is literally, we need to invest a lot of money in trying to change Israel's image because people are starting to catch on to the fact that it's a illegal, unethical occupation, almost makes me think it's in their favor, because you can't think that there's like a dark propaganda agenda behind such a blatantly clear message of wanting to do propaganda.
Yeah, right.
But so their little blurb, and again, I remind you that this is the organization that sponsored Vegan Vibes that we're going to be talking about. So they say Vibe Israel is igniting a new conversation about Israel as a vibrant source of creativity and innovation. Welcome to an Israel of flavors, music, business and medicine, aromas, arts, and culture. This is how we're doing it. We're inviting the world's online opinion leaders into our home. Bloggers with millions of followers who write about photography, architecture, family, science, food, fashion, music, clean tech. They spend a week in Israel and share their experience. Above all, they fall in love with the people and the vibe influencing millions of people around the world, creating businesses and cultural connections. That's not all Vibe Israel does, though. We bring global brand events to Israel. We produce marketing kits of Israel as the startup nation. We develop online campaigns about Israel, positioning Israel as a hub of creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship, reintroducing the world to our home. There's no place like home, and there's no place like Israel.
Oh my God.
So,
They forgot to mention the part about how the innovation is in new and innovative ways to kill people. But anyway, yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
so Laura, can you talk a little bit about how this fits into Brand Israel and how Vibe Israel is a part of their agenda, and how Vegan Vibe, as a branch of Vibe Israel, also promotes the agenda of Brand Israel. Wow, I said Israel so many times in that sentence.
Right. Which is what they want. Israel, 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 Israel. Come to Israel. Make aliyah to Israel. Yes. Well, I think that basically the best way to answer that question is to go into my little history tour of Brand Israel and what it is and what its function is, who is funding it, who's behind it, what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, Brand Israel was founded in 2006. 2006 was a very significant year in Israeli and Palestinian history because that was actually the year that Yasser Arafat died.
For the listeners who don't know, can you talk about who Yasser?
Yeah, I was just about to say. So Yasser Arafat was the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Of course, he's the one that I was talking about earlier that I used to see when I was a kid at the UN speaking, and everybody said he was a terrorist, but I was like, what is he doing at the UN? So Palestinian Liberation Organization was the government of Palestine. And
Right.
of course, if you talk to Zionists, they'll say they're a terrorist organization. But they existed for many years, from the time when the Israeli state was created in 1948 up until Arafat died in 2006. So he was the leader for not the whole time, obviously, but for many decades, like since the 70s. And when he died, that left this huge vacuum. And so what ended up happening was that the PLO turned into what is now called the Palestinian Authority, or Fatah. And then there was another political party that rose up. I'm sure you've heard this name before, Hamas. And Hamas actually ended up becoming the government in Gaza. So they had like an election. And the PA stayed the government in the West Bank, but Gaza went with Hamas. So
Mm-hmm.
when that happened, Israel decided to punish Gaza for electing Hamas. And that is when they actually put the blockade on Gaza, which is basically, well, okay, I should backtrack for a second here. There were actually Israeli settlers living in Gaza at that time, up until that point, and they cleared those people out. The Israeli military actually went in and cleared those people out. And so Gaza, everybody originally thought that this was going to be a good thing because it seemed like the Palestinians were going to have Gaza as their own. And then essentially after that, Israel turned it into a giant concentration camp, open air concentration camp. They blocked the borders so that The Palestinians can't get in and out of Gaza. They're trapped in there. And then they put this horrific blockade on them where they started starving them. They wouldn't let any food in there. They wouldn't let any medicine in there, and bombing them on an ongoing basis. So that's what was happening in 2006. But also what was happening in 2006 was that Israel was realizing that they had an image problem in the rest of the world, particularly in America, which is in the US, which is very important to them because the US is funding them. Actually, we are giving them $3.5 billion a year in money and weapons. And also because they want young US American Jews to emigrate to Israel. And that's a process they call the Make Aliyah. So that's when a Jewish person claims their quote unquote right of return and moves to Israel, because the policy of Israel is that any Jewish person anywhere in the world is entitled to come and get citizenship there just on the basis of them being Jewish. On the other hand, the Palestinians who were born there can't even get back into their own home. Palestinians living in the diaspora, some of them are still in refugee camps 50, 60, 70 years later, still cannot go home. But any Jewish person can pick up and move. And this is essential to Israel's existence as a Jewish state, because in order to maintain that, they have to maintain demographic supremacy. They have to have more Jews living there than Palestinians. So it is absolutely vital to their existence that they have Jews making aliyah to Israel. So they realized that they had this image problem, and they realized that basically a lot of young Americans, and the reason they want young people, of course, is because they want you to move to Israel, get married, and start having children. And that way you can propagate. I almost want to say propagate the species, but you can probably think too much in animal rights terms, but you can propagate the race. And then they will maintain their demographic majority. Very much how white supremacists think, actually, white nationalists. So anyway, so they really wanted to reach the young Jewish and also just young American, US American liberals. They felt that that was their target demographic, and specifically for some reason, young males, like the mid-teens to early 30s range. So what happened was that the foreign ministry decided that they were going to create this initiative called Brand Israel, and they were going to funnel large sums of money into improving Israel's image in the world. And what they found out through a lot of market research was that there was quite a lot of support for Israel amongst the US public, but that they weren't really excited about Israel. They were kind of apathetic. They saw it as very sort of religious and old-fashioned and traditionalist, and it just wasn't appealing to young people. And so they felt that Israel's image needed a makeover, essentially. So what they started doing was they started collaborating with some of the biggest ad agencies in New York. Actually, they were working with Rubicam and Young. They were working with Saatchi and Saatchi, and they were conducting all of this market research, trying to find out what will appeal to young US Americans in those demographics, and especially again the liberals and obviously the Jews, but also just basically young people and liberals were their two main targets outside of the Jewish community. So the first thing that they did, the first initiative that they launched, brace yourselves, feminists, this is really gruesome. So they put out a spread in Maxim magazine, which for those who don't know is a men's magazine, of women of the IDF. IDF is the Israeli quote unquote defense forces. This is actually the Israeli military that is occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, as well as the Syrian territory of the Golan Heights. So they put out this spread. Now, in Israel, all genders have to serve in the military. So they put out this spread of women who have served in the military, and it was like these models in bikinis, and Gal Gadot, we all know her, of course, from Wonder Woman, this image of her like splayed out in this bikini in this very sexualized, provocative pose. And they had like this gala, and it was sponsored by Maxim, and they had this big spread in Maxim magazine. And then after that, they conducted more market research, and oh, what do you know? All the young guys were suddenly interested in Israel. Right. So that was kind of how they started. But they really still wanted to reach the liberal demographic. And, outright sexism is not probably going to appeal to liberal women in particular. And so they had to find something else. And so as they were scouting around, trying to find what was going to be the next thing that they were going to use to market themselves, suddenly they fell upon the issue of gay rights. And they suddenly realized,
wow, I did not realize that they hadn't started with pinkwashing at all, that it started as like a hetero campaign to recruit.
it absolutely did.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was so incredibly heterosexist and heterosexual, and yeah. And it was interesting because they kind of went from that. Then they had like a little bit of we're feminist campaign as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of like people in the mainstream feminist movement support Israel for that reason,
Right.
as being kind of like the only feminist country in the Middle East, yada yada yada.
Right. And of course, the whole underlying sort of subtext of that is, oh, we're not like those barbaric Muslims, who abuse their women and who hang gay people and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Look how civilized and progressive we are in comparison to the rest of the Middle East.
Of course.
So yeah, and of course, I mean, even now, you keep getting these articles. Yes, you can be a liberal, a Zionist, and a feminist. No, you can't. But we have intersectionality to thank for people starting to, white women at least, starting to see through that a little more. But anyway, so so they were kind of looking for their next thing. Then they, and oh, I should mention that in the midst of this, they also were kind of funding like a lot of food festivals and wine festivals, and they were one of the sponsors of the Toronto International Film Festival, and they had this whole section of the film festival, Spotlight Israel. Now, I remember at the time that there were a lot of complaints from people in the film industry community that, were supporting Palestine, and they were like, what the heck is this? But, at that stage, of course, none of us were really connecting the dots. This was all part of the same sort of initiative. So eventually in 2009, the International Gay and Lesbian Travel Association announced that they were going to have their official conference in Tel Aviv. And that same year, Stand With Us. Now, Stand With Us is a blatantly Zionist organization that actually, like, a large percentage of Hollywood is involved with. And they told the Jerusalem Post that they were undertaking a campaign to promote Israel as a gay Mecca.
Did they use that word?
No, they didn't use that word. That's my word. Just for extra irony's sake.
Right. We hear it again and again that Israel is the vegan Mecca, so I wouldn't be surprised if.
Exactly. And I mean, that's such an ironic term to use, the vegan Mecca.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
like, what a slap in the face to Muslims on top of everything else that they're using the word Mecca. Yeah.
right.
So that happened, and then the foreign ministry actually told Ynet, which is an Israeli news website, that they were going to be sponsoring a gay Olympics delegation to, quote, show the world Israel's diverse and liberal face. So this basically continued after that. They 2010 they had the Tel Aviv Tourism Board collaborated with the main LGBTQ rights organization in Israel to launch Tel Aviv Gay Vibe.
There's that word again.
Right. And then in April 2010, they actually launched Israeli Pride Month in San Francisco. So they were actually funding a gay pride festival with a focus on Israel and San Francisco, on top of everything else. So around this time, this was getting so blatantly obvious that something was rotten in Tel Aviv that there was an organization called Queers Undermining Israeli Terrorism, and they were radical, queer, mostly people of color in San Francisco that pretty much saw through what was going on. And they were the ones who started using the term pinkwashing. Although I've heard that actually the term originally came from Ali Abu Nima, who is a Palestinian writer and activist, and he runs a really fantastic website called The Electronic Intifada.
Mm-hmm.
So he was the one who originally coined that term, and then the acronym is QUIT, Q-U-I-T, but it's Queers Undermining Israeli Terrorism. They started using that term. And meanwhile, and they were trying to protest it, and they were really trying to say, especially Arab queer activists were trying to say, look at what is going on here.
Mm-hmm.
This is Israel behind this, using us, exploiting our movement, exploiting our struggle for liberation to make themselves look progressive. Meanwhile, the Israeli efforts continued unabated to exploit gay rights, and I'm specifically saying gay rights because, of course, they weren't even touching the trans issue or anything to do with gender nonconformity or anything like that. That just would have been, too weird for their image, their brand name. But they could get, very gender conforming, Ken and Barbie doll model type.
Yeah, I've actually been struck by how normative their campaigns for gay Israel are. Like if you go on their website, yeah, Ken is a perfect way to describe it. It's
Right.
these like tall, white, Speedo wearing men. Nothing wrong with that, but
Well, there's a real history with that actually, because when Israel was first formed, of course, they were coming out of 2,000 years of oppression in Europe. They were coming out of the Holocaust. They were coming out of, now again, even when I really think about it, even right from the very start, they've always had this concern with image and branding, because at that time their image was Jews are little and weak and scrawny, or they're, like dumpy, and they're sickly and they're weak, and they're not able to fight, of course, the Germans, who were the quote unquote Aryan, the strong and the vibrant and the healthy and the blonde and the whole 9 yards. And so what they started doing was actually right from the start, they were trying to rebrand themselves in this very horrifyingly, not only oppressive in terms of white supremacist standards of beauty and that sort of thing cosmetically, but also in terms of health. It was extremely ableist and ageist right from the start of, we want to protect this image of youth, of health, of militarism, and of whiteness. And that is something that really goes very deeply back into their history. And you see it all over this current branding image, except for another part that I'm going to get to, where they're trying to exploit now, quote unquote, diversity. But that's really at the root of it, is this sort of trying to mold themselves into this Aryan, white supremacist, patriarchal, militaristic image.
That's so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we did the interview with Mexi on anti-Semitism, I actually looked into biblical imagery and all the horrid imagery there was around the Jewish money launderer with the hooked noses and small and scrawny, etc. And I hadn't made that connection actually, even though I had noticed that the imagery around promoting that brand was so Aryan-like and white supremacist-like. But
right.
That's a really interesting
right.
point I hadn't thought about, as also dispelling this like racist imagery of Jews in the past.
Very racist, very ableist.
Absolutely.
Very, yeah, lookist, if you want to call it that. Yeah, I mean, this is so horrifying, but actually an Israeli leftist friend of mine, big solidarity, Palestinian solidarity activist, also a vegan, she actually told me, and also feminist, and actually I think she's also gay as well. So these are like, all of these issues are hitting her, all of these exploitative campaigns are hitting her. And she told me that when this is so horrifying, when the Jews first came from Europe that had just come from the concentration camps, there were already European Jews who had come much earlier to Palestine, even prior to the Holocaust. So they'd been living there already for several decades at that stage. And when the Jews came over from Europe that had just come out of the camps, those Jews who'd been living in Palestine actually called them soapies. The reason why they called them soapies was because of this whole, now this has never really been fully confirmed of whether this actually happened, but this rumor at least that the Nazis made soap out of their skin and their,
that's so horrific.
And they mocked them for that because they were like, you are weak, you are pathetic. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, just horrifying, this whole eugenics influence in Israel. And it really comes from a very deep-rooted insecurity at the end of the day that does come from their historical trauma, and that does come from this inferiority complex that they will always have. Maybe they won't always have it, maybe they'll overcome it, but I think they'll only overcome it by actually doing right by the Palestinians and standing in solidarity with them rather than continuing to abuse and violate them. But anyway, so we're continuing with this horrendous history of exploitation of gay rights. So in July of that same year, 2010, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which is a big Jewish-led organization that is supposed to be anti-bigotry, anti-hate, but that is extremely Zionist. They hosted Stand With Us, so they're Stand With Us again, very overtly Zionist, unlike the ADL, to discuss gay rights in Israel and a gay presence in the Israeli Defense Forces. So they want to make sure that you know that they have a gay-friendly military.
And it's also vegan friendly, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. You can request special boots that are made out of faux leather and special berets that are made out of faux wool. And you can be gay. It's really...
And you can request them to be pink and have glitter as well.
Great. That makes everything that they're doing okay.
Right. So here we have these repeating patterns they keep using over and over again. And once you know the patterns, and once you know what to look for, it's like, oh my God, there they are up to their shenanigans yet again. So yes, basically that's kind of some backstory on how they exploited gay rights. But now I'm also going to talk about the fact that they have exploited the environmental movement as well. And actually they were, so again, Brand Israel was one of the main sponsors of the People's Climate March in New York City.
Yeah, that's shocking.
Shocking. Yes. It's very funny because if you look at their actual track record on these issues, they're horrifying. They're one of the biggest polluters. They're number 33 on a list of 36 countries for air pollution.
Wow.
And number 22 out of 33 on water pollution. And
in the top 10, the highest meat consumption per capita countries as well.
Meat consumption in the top 5. And actually, this was very interesting. I was reading some actual statistics from Tobias Lanart, of all people. So are you familiar with Tobias Lanart? Oh my God. So Tobias Lanart is actually one of these effective altruism figureheads.
Ah, yes, effective altruism. I have my own video on that on YouTube if you're interested to check it out.
Right. So I know you know about the effective altruism. Yes. So he is one of these wonderful people that thinks that utilitarianism and capitalism is going to save the world and turn it not quite vegan, but
close enough.
A little closer to veganism, or at least they'll eat more chickens instead of cows or something.
Right.
No, excuse me, more cows instead of chickens. How could I forget? Because you have to eat
More
lots of
cows
chicken.
instead of chicken. Right, right, because it's technically harming less lives.
Right. You have to kill a lot of chickens to get
Okay, okay.
the body composition of a cow. Yeah.
Right, right, right.
Anyway, Tobias Leonhardt actually went to Israel to check out the vegan movement there. But very interestingly, I have to hand it to him, he also went to the Israeli occupied Palestinian West Bank. And he didn't go to the settlements as a guest of the settlement, as a guest of the settlers, because I have to say that if I heard that on the surface, I would think, oh, he probably went to the settlements in the West Bank. So just to explain to the listeners what the settlements are, basically these are housing complexes for Jews only in the Palestinian territory of the West Bank. This was the thing that I mentioned earlier, that they used to have these in Gaza, but then they cleared them out. But they still have them in the West Bank, and they're like these apartheid complexes. Generally, what will happen is that when they're building one, there will be Palestinian houses standing there, and the Israeli military will just come in and bulldoze those houses. And they don't even give warning to the Palestinians. Palestinians are at work or school. They come home, their house is demolished. There's nothing they can do. They have no rights. They get no compensation. They're left to fend for themselves. And then they build these apartheid complexes on top of that land. Or sometimes they will even just take over the Palestinian homes. And it's like, oh, you don't live here anymore. Too bad on you. That's an Israeli family living in there now. So anyway, sometimes people say they've been to the West Bank, and what they actually mean is that they went to these apartment complexes, and these apartment complexes are actually connected by Jews-only roads. They have Jews-only schools, Jews-only hospitals. So there are like this whole apartheid system where you could just stay in that and never even see what's going on with the Palestinians. But he didn't do that, and I have to give him credit. He went to East Jerusalem, which is Palestinian, and then he also went to Hebron. Hebron is one of the worst situations in all of the Israeli occupied West Bank. When I was in Palestine, I didn't even get to go to Hebron because we were supposed to do a performance. It was like a theater tour. I don't know if I mentioned that before, but we were supposed to do a performance in Hebron, and to get to the location of the show, the Palestinian children, had to walk by the Israeli settlements. And normally when that happens, if you can believe this, the Palestinians have to arrange for Israeli military accompaniment for the children. Because if the Israeli military does not accompany the children when they're walking past the settlements, the settlers are likely to come out and actually attack the children physically. I know that is shocking, but that is what happens. They will actually come out and attack the children physically. And the reason why they do this is because they believe that this is their land given to them by God. It goes all the way back to the Bible. That's what the promised land is all about. They want to make life so miserable for the Palestinians that they will leave. So for this show, the Palestinian organizers didn't manage to arrange the Israeli military accompaniment, and we never even ended up going to Hebron for that reason. But Tobias Leonhardt went to Hebron, and he saw the situation, and even he had to admit, he kind of gave the whole BS, oh, there were two sides to every story, blah, blah. But then he flat out said it. I can't imagine how this could possibly be just. It's just not right, So Tobias Leonhardt, while he was in Israel, he did some research on what the real statistics were of the Israeli veganism. And what he found out was that they're actually much lower than what we are being told. He said that according to the Central Bureau of Statistics, he wrote this like last year, so this is not old information. He said 4.7% of Israelis are vegetarian, 1.7% identify as vegan.
Really? You always hear it's a 10%.
So we always hear 10%. He said some will say 5% when you're actually there, but that's like the high end estimate is 5%, more like 5% vegetarian and less than 2% vegan. So yeah, they're not anywhere near a vegan nation.
Well, can I ask you, I
Yeah.
feel like some of the people listening to this episode might say, well, shouldn't we make a distinction between Israeli occupation and their government and the Israeli vegans? Shouldn't we dissociate the two and just embrace those who are vegan because that is the cause that we care about? Who cares if they're Israeli and if they promote a Zionist agenda?
Right. So the first thing I want to say in response to that is that this is again where Vibe Israel and Brand Israel comes in again, because Vibe Israel is promoting Israel, of course, as a vegan nation. It turns out the CEO of Vibe Israel, Joanna Landau, is on the board of directors for Brand Israel. Brand Israel, as you may recall, I mentioned earlier, is a creation of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. So that is not to say that there is not a real vegan movement in Israel, but there is no question at this stage that it is being exploited and it is being promoted in much the same way that gay rights was. So this is why we're hearing about things like, oh, the Israeli military is vegan friendly, and we serve them vegan meals and vegan berets and vegan leather boots and blah blah blah. This is why we have a vegan birthright tour. So to talk about birthright was created in 1996 to get young Jews in the diaspora, which means living in other parts of the world, not in Israel, to come to Israel and just fall in love with the place and want to move there and get married and have babies. Lots of babies, preferably. They basically created this birth, so the name says it all, birthright. As in, it is your right by virtue of your birth as a Jewish person to move to Israel, to come to Israel, to see Israel, and ultimately to move to Israel.
Yeah, I cannot tell you how many people I grew up with who went on a birthright, but also how incredibly normalized it was in my mind for so many years that indeed,
Yeah.
because of their history, they had a right to go back to Israel. And it wasn't until I first heard someone make the argument, like, why do these people who have never been to Israel have the right to supposedly return even though they've never been, when there are people literally kilometers away that are kept from entering Israel, that are Palestinian? And I was like, wait, yeah, what?
Yeah, really.
I mean, even without knowing a lot about the situation, I was like, yeah, it's true that like that smells a bit fishy.
Right, that's the whole thing, is that like everything's like sort of smooth, but then there are these like little ruptures.
Yeah.
Don't quite fit. Yeah. So yeah, they created this tour. It is fully 100% funded by the Israeli government. You get an all expense paid trip to Israel.
I mean, yeah, like that sounded so fun to me as a teen. I was like,
No
I can't.
kidding.
Yeah. It's like, I want to fucking do that.
I know. I remember it did cross my mind for a little while there, because I was like,
bet.
oh, wow, I could get a free trip to Israel. I
Like,
really love
what the hell is free nowadays, except for birthright, I guess.
Yeah. And this was at a time when I didn't really know what was going on there. I can totally see why people would be like, yeah, I'll take that.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. And so they pay for everything, all expense paid trip. I mean, the images to advertise these things, it looks like a Kontiki tour.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, for all young people, like you're going to Lollapalooza or something. It's like,
right.
It's so gruesome.
I mean, that shit looked fun.
Yeah, it looks like Coachella or something.
Oh yeah, exactly.
We're like driving through the Negev desert with the wind blowing in our hair, and
right. Pick yourself up a hot soldier.
Right. I was just about to say that. You beat me to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we love IDF boys. Oh my God, it's so horrifying. And it's for ages 18 to 26. But I just saw that they have a new one now. Finally, they're like, if you're 27 to 32, you can finally do our young professionals tour of Israel. So I guess they're getting desperate. They'll even take 32-year-olds with their old
Gross.
decaying eggs.
Oh my God.
So anyway, this is basically what they have been doing since the mid 90s, but just last year they launched a new birthright tour, and they've got like all these different ones. I mean, I was looking at them and it was like, oh, birthright for film lovers and birthright for food and wine
Oh
lovers.
my God. Are you
And now
joking?
they've got vegan birthright. And so you can tour the country and they will show you all the wonderful vegan food that they have appropriated and are claiming is Israeli. So we were going to talk about that. You mentioned earlier, and I do want to say something about that. So basically, all this food,
Hmm.
Middle Eastern food, traditionally, a lot of it is just naturally vegan. Falafel is vegan, hummus is vegan, baba ganoush, which is like an eggplant spread, is vegan, tabbouleh, fool, like all of these different dishes are naturally vegan, and they are traditional regional dishes. Um, so they are Arab dishes. They are also, of course, traditional dishes of what they call Mizrahi Jews, which are Jews from the Middle East,
Hmm.
and they are traditional Palestinian dishes. And now all of a sudden, Israel is claiming that they are Israeli dishes. This is the cuisine of Israel. But of
Hmm.
course, Israel has only been around for 70 years. And so, again, this insecurity issue of them not really feeling very solid in their identity because they are a colonizer country and a very new colonizer country at that. And they are trying to
Hmm.
build this identity by stealing everything that already existed there. So you can take a vegan birthright tour. The army is being marketed as vegan. Netanyahu has expressed interest in going vegan. But I mean, the brand Israel thing is a really clear sign that this is coming directly from the government. The Israeli Board of Tourism is promoting vegan tours of Israel, even outside of Birthright. If you're just somebody who wants to come to Israel, you can take a vegan tour, vegan cruise to Israel. I mean, there is no question about it that this is something that, and it makes sense they would use it in this way. Something else I really wanted to bring up in this interview is we as a movement have kind of put ourselves at risk of being exploited in this way because we have embraced consumerism,
Right.
vegan consumerism, and that aligns perfectly with a propaganda campaign like this. If we as a movement were resolutely anti capitalist, if we were resolutely anti colonialist,
Hmm.
if we stood in clear solidarity with the oppressed people of the world,
Hmm.
they would not be using us in this way.
It's so true. There's no way that if veganism was politicized as an anti-oppression stance, the Israeli government would be able to capitalize on our movement in this way.
Right, but as long as we keep this, oh, it's just about, vegan food and vegan clothes and non-leather this and non-wool that and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And even the animal rights, that at least is an anti-oppression stance. But if we make it exclusively about non-human animal rights, that also is very safe for them to
Hmm.
use in that way.
Hmm. Right. And also I think the very individualized notion of health that
Oh,
is
yeah,
really dominant in certain groups of veganism, like have a clean, fresh, organic, colorful diet,
absolutely.
lends itself very well to the image that Israel wants to promote.
Right.
And also, there has been 5 years in a row a huge vegan congress
Oh, yes.
organized in Tel Aviv about vegan health. I think it's about vegan ethics as well. But there are a tremendous amount of health conferences that
Right.
go on in Tel Aviv to promote plant-based eating. And the fact that veganism has been associated with this almost like purity organic like elitist diet also lends itself very well to the new way that they want to promote themselves.
Right. And I mean, this goes directly back to what I was saying earlier about the origins of Israel and the image that they originally wanted to promote, which was this image of strength, vitality, militarism, white supremacist beauty standards, eugenics.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the way that the vegan movement has gone in the West has really primed itself for that. It's like, of course they would try to exploit it that way.
What do you say to Gary Yourofsky's argument? Not that, I'm dying to talk about him, but I remember one of his arguments for the fact that Israel was going vegan in such massive numbers is that, exploited and victimized people are more likely to empathize with exploited and victimized animals. And
But not
that,
exploited and victimized Palestinians
right.
or Africans or yeah, I don't know about that one. Yeah, I mean,
But I think that is like a narrative that also is pretty prevalent in the vegan movement, is that, well, of course Israel would be more likely to go vegan because they're a nation of oppressed people. Can you talk a little bit about like that victimized narrative of Israelis and how that is utilized by the Israeli government to really use their citizens as agents of diffusing this ideology to legitimize the state?
yeah, it's incredibly disturbing about that because the truth of the matter is that um that logic could and should make sense, but doesn't, because clearly it's not consistent. Um, but, if you know anything about the history of the Holocaust, there is an amazing book. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It should be required reading for pretty much everyone in the human race, as far as I'm concerned, but certainly anyone who's interested in these issues, called Eternal Treblinka by Charles Patterson, and it talks about how the origins of the Holocaust came directly from the animal exploitation industries, how the eugenics movement came out of that, directly out of that, how all the original eugenicists had previous careers in the animal exploitation industries, how they modeled the concentration camps after slaughterhouses, and in some cases even used slaughterhouses for concentration camps. How so many of the Nazis had backgrounds as slaughterers or in some other way worked directly in animal exploitation industries. So, yeah, there should be that sort of empathy from that heritage. And certainly the Jews that actually experienced the Holocaust, that was something that profoundly they made those connections. Isaac Bashevis Singer is a great example of that. In fact, the term Eternal Treblinka comes from a short story that he wrote about a Holocaust survivor who forms a friendship with a mouse that is in his house. And one day he's looking at this little mouse and he thinks to himself, for animals, all humans are Nazis, and it is just an eternal Treblinka for them. Treblinka was a Nazi concentration camp, and so he says, for animals, we are the Nazis. So you would think that there would be that connection there, and I wonder for some of them. I'm not Israeli, so I can't speak on their behalf in terms of how this issue resonates for them, but it's possible that on the one hand they do have that history that they're very conscious of. I mean, their whole nation exists. That's the whole justification for their nation even existing, is that history. So it's constantly drilled into their heads. But of course, it's drilled into their heads in a way that is always associated with justifying Zionism. And if you know anything about neurology and psychology, when you make those connections repeatedly, it actually forms like neural pathways in your brain that, when you think of one, you automatically think of the other. Those associations are so strong. So it's like that's just been drilled into them that Holocaust equals Zionism and Israel. This is the reason why Israel must exist. This is the reason why we must protect Israel always. And so I think that they have kind of shut out, maybe compassion for Palestinians on that basis.
Mm-hmm.
Africans is a whole other story because they've also got a lot of African immigrants coming into the country that there's horrifying racism against. I won't go into all the details, but it's a shocking level of anti-African racism, and actually they're being kicked out now. So the same sort of like anti-immigrant sentiment that's going on in the US is going on in Israel. And that is actually what is causing the Libyan slave trade, because the Africans are being kicked out of Israel and then they're getting abducted by Libyan enslavers. And actually, yeah. So anyway, that would be like a whole other thing I'd have to talk about. But I just to talk about the Palestinians, I feel like they're kind of shutting that off because they see them as a threat to Israel, and Israel must exist because the Jews are always persecuted and they always will be persecuted, blah, blah, blah. And then I think the animal issue, it's possible, might be kind of filling that gap because they may know on some level that it's wrong. And it's kind of like this makes them feel better in some way. You know, oh, but look, I am an ethical person. Look, I care about animals. And it's also possible that, yes, they are identifying with the animals, but in this way of animals are innocent completely. And animals are blameless for their situation.
Interesting.
And so that's, in a way, a very kind of, once you get over the hump of, oh, I have to actually make a personal sacrifice here of not consuming them anymore, then you can feel very noble. And you can feel like, oh, look, they're innocent victims of their circumstances, and so are we. And so it's easy to feel morally superior in that way. That's just, I mean, that's an outsider's perspective, but that's, I think, possibly what's going on there.
Yeah, I think that is a very insightful observation even for other white people in the vegan movement. I think that veganism lends itself very well to the white savior complex of wanting to speak for the completely voiceless. And yeah, it was AFCO who said veganism is a racial identity for white people.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's so interesting to bring that up because I've been doing some reading on social identity theory. And in social identity theory, you know, basically it's this whole thing of it's a human drive to have this identity, this aspect of your identity that gives you a community or clique or whatever you want to call it. And it's very interesting because when I was reading about that, I was like, clearly vegans, white vegans, this is very important to them. This aspect of their identity, vegan, because white people, especially from settler cultures like the US, like Australia, like Israel, they lose their cultural heritage through that. It's replaced by this settler colonial existence that kind of wipes out everything else. Kind of has to wipe everything else out in order to exist. And so, because they don't have that anymore, because they don't have community, veganism becomes that thing for them. And so, if you really understand social identity theory, then it becomes very clear why, for example, they feel like they need their own flag to start off with, which, by the way, was created by an Israeli.
Was it?
Yeah, it was an Israeli that designed that. And I can't get over the video because apparently there's some other symbolism to this. Have you seen the video that?
Yeah, isn't it like white is for purity or something?
Yeah, white is for purity.
I cannot believe they said that.
Yeah. And then something else that just shocked me in the video was there's actually an image of like a locked gate.
Is there? Okay.
Yeah. And I was like, what?
What does it stand for?
So there's
like literally we are a gated community type of
thing?
That's
what I was thinking. I was like, are you trying to tell us that we're a gated community? And,
right.
You know, this is like a membership only club? Like, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
Apparently do you know what a love lock is?
I do not. Oh, a love lock. Yes, like those necklaces?
Yeah, but it's like apparently, because I didn't know what the heck this was, but then other people were saying, oh, it's a love lock, and it's like representing your like like your eternal commitment to veganism or something, but or to animal rights. Not that they ever talked about them, huh? But like it was a locked gate. Like,
Right.
so anyway, coming back to what Fco was saying, I was like, if you really understand social identity theory, and then you think about how this would apply to white people and veganism and their being vegans as an identity, this is why they feel so threatened by people of color wanting to have their own interpretation of veganism
Mm-hmm.
through their perspective of a non-white, non-Western perspective, because they feel like they are, it's like, this is our space,
Right.
this is our identity, and you are co-opting it. This is our thing. Get your own thing. Like, that's actually, I think, what's going on subconsciously.
Totally. And, since animals are like complete victims, I think that identifying as their spokesperson, some people get really confused between who is the oppressed person. Is it them or is it the animals? Obviously, it's the animals, but I do think they take on the identity of being the oppressed class sometimes.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And you can project anything you want onto animals.
Absolutely, yeah.
They have no ability to say no. And it was really interesting because I'm sure you've heard a lot of people, especially a lot of non-vegans, they kind of make jokes about veganism being like a religion.
Right.
And that we're like vegan zealots. And somebody called me a vegan evangelical the other day. It was really interesting because I was thinking about that recently, and I was like, what does veganism and religion have in common? Well, actually, I hate to say it, but religion, organized religion, they can say whatever they want and claim it was God who said it or God who wanted it. And it's an absent referent, which is what Carol Adams always talks about. This
Oh, yeah.
entity that is like, that's what everybody's supposed to be talking about, or you know their interests are being represented or whatever, but they have no say in the matter. That's God. It's like, well, God wants this, God wants that. Well, the animals want this. The animals don't like it when you do that, and that is used as a mechanism for control.
Totally. Yeah, that's such a great point. It's really a way to rid yourself of any kind of accountability.
Right, no accountability. So it's a great way to control others through this absent referent that you claim to speak on behalf of, voice of the voiceless, but they have no say in the matter.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to make sure to ask you another question because going through Caitlin's Instagram, so for my goal, I'm really not picking on her in particular. She's just the one that I follow most closely, and also she's been getting quite a bit of pushback. I don't know if quite a bit. I don't know proportionally what it represents. If it's just a few dissonant voices who are like, hey, it's really not cool to be participating in vegan washing, or if it's like actually a notable number of people. Anyway, I have no idea, but she made a video, like she spoke on her Instagram story about the fact that this was only a food trip, that she had no political motives and was very uninformed about the situation. And one comment that kept coming up again and again, so I actually I copied one of the comments because I think that it was a very good example of this position that kept coming up in defense of Caitlin, sorry. So this comment says, oh my God, if people avoided traveling to countries that didn't have a corrupt government / conflict, there would be nowhere left to travel to. There's conflict everywhere, some worse than others, but slamming a food blogger for traveling to a place of conflict when it is pretty obvious it was for a vegan trip, I think is totally unacceptable. I live in Australia and don't support their policies like the refugee crisis. People live in the USA and wouldn't support the gun laws, but that doesn't mean you should just avoid going to those countries. Visiting a country doesn't mean you support their government. So there's a few things that I want to weed out for this message from this comment. First, why is it worse to travel to Israel? Isn't it selective to bash someone for traveling to Israel when, the US has a bunch of obviously imperialist, disgusting history and like a history of slavery and actively imperialist policies still being waged across the world? So that is the first question. And my second question would be, if all travel to Israel
Right.
for you is the same and the same amount of problematic, or if you think that, traveling on behalf of a state-sponsored Israel trip is worse.
Okay, so let's address the first question first. So, yes, absolutely. Israel is not the only country that has a horrifying human rights record. Although I will say, believe it or not, that last year the UN voted them the worst human rights criminals in the world.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
So they are pretty freaking bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that's compared to the US, which I
Mm-hmm.
honestly think is, I personally would say the US is a strong contender for, I would say, even beating Israel on that
Mm-hmm.
level, because what we do to the world is global, whereas theirs is more regional. Although they are spreading their, I won't say wings, what will I say? They're spreading their talons. But
Right, and then there's the whole point that Israel is doing it with American dollars anyway, so it's like one big.
right, exactly. And not just American dollars, but American weapons. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
most of the weapons they have come directly from us. In fact, they're even stamped. I've seen pictures of them stamped, made in the USA.
Damn.
My God, I feel so proud to be American looking at that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they're certainly not the only human rights abusers, although they are severe. But there's two big differences. First of all, of course, is the fact that they are conducting this illegal, in violation of international law, military occupation of part of their land. So it's kind of complicated because they're controlling the land, but it isn't supposed to be theirs by any standard. That is supposed to be Palestinian land, but they are militarily occupying it. So the best analogy I could give for that would be like if um, the United States military was occupying native reservations in the U.S. And I mean, like occupying them 24/7 for decades, and regularly bombing them, and locking people in there, and intentionally starving them, and
Mm-hmm.
bulldozing their homes and building apartheid settlements. If we were doing that to the Native Americans, well, I don't want to say Native Americans,
Mm-hmm.
Native Turtle Islanders, but if we were doing that to First Nations people, that would be more similar to what is happening with Israel and Palestine. And of course, the other thing is that we are, as you said before, funding them and arming them. So our relationship with that situation is different than, let's say, other human rights abusers in the world that we're not funding and arming. But we're funding and arming quite a few of them, actually. Not to the extent of Israel, but we are funding and arming a lot of human rights abusers, not just Israel. But the really, really big difference, and I really pray that the listeners have gotten to this stage of the interview, because I feel like this point is getting lost and it is so, so important, is that the Palestinians have organized a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement to put international economic and, of course, publicity, also pressure on Israel to at least end their illegal military occupation of the Palestinian territories, to end their apartheid system, and to end their ethnic cleansing policies. This boycott movement is modeled after the South African BDS movement. So basically, the South Africans had a movement that was pretty much the same. Nelson Mandela, of course, was one of the leaders of that movement. And the Palestinians got the idea from them and thought, well, we will try and use a similar movement to end apartheid in Israel as the South Africans ended apartheid in South Africa. So when you go to Israel, especially under these circumstances, now if you just go as a tourist and you just kind of like go around sightseeing or whatever, um, it's not, I mean, yeah, you're supporting Israeli businesses, and
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of a violation of the boycott in and of itself, but that's not the end of the world. And of course, also, if you go there, you have the opportunity to go to Israeli occupied Palestine, to the West Bank. You can't get into Gaza because Gaza is blocked off, but you can go to the Israeli occupied Palestinian West Bank, and that is something that I think everyone should do if they can, to see what is really going on there. So
Right.
that's a very different story. If this had just been that those, the vegan YouTubers, bloggers had gone on vacation there, that would be a very different story. But
Mm-hmm.
the real issue is the boycott specifically says do not go to Israel and make public
Mm-hmm.
appearances. Because when you go and you make a public appearance, Israel is using that to promote their image in the world. So whether you go there to speak, or whether you go there to perform, or whether you go there to, if it's something like this where it's going to be filmed, anything like that, you are in serious violation of the boycott then.
Right.
And then, of course, on top of that, this was even worse because it wasn't even like they were just going to some organization within Israel
Mm-hmm.
to, speak at some event or something. But this was actually like you said it when you described that Fight Israel video. They blatantly say their mission is to improve Israel's image in the world. That's what that's all about.
Oh, yeah, they were basically offered a free,
Right.
idyllic trip in exchange for blogging heavily about it to
Exactly.
their hundreds of thousands of followers.
Exactly.
And they very explicitly said it too, and in their post announcing the trip, like, we're going to Israel for the sole purpose of, with the exact wording I think was, for the sole purpose of eating plant-based food and raising awareness of Israel as the vegan capital of the world.
Right. And I mean, that, it's pretty obvious. Oh, we're going to take you around to all these restaurants and serve you all this delicious food and show you all these beautiful sights. And,
Take you to organic farms.
right. And isn't Israel beautiful and culturally interesting? And we have all this great food and we're so vegan friendly. Come to Israel. Come to
Mhm.
Israel. Support Israel. Move to Israel if you're Jewish. Like, that's what this is all about.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, this was very different than just going, oh, hey, I'm going to go on a little trip and, just
Mm-hmm.
on my own.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very different. And I don't blame them for not knowing that beforehand, except I have to say, so I know for a fact that the Palestinian Animal League, so just to give some background on who they are, so they're an animal rights organization in the Israeli occupied Palestinian West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
So these are Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation who have formed this organization to promote animal rights and veganism. They actually invited, I know at least they invited the Buddhist chef. I'm not sure about the other ones, but I know they invited him. And they said, why don't you come
Mm-hmm.
over to Palestine? If you're going to come, come to the West Bank and learn about what's going on here, learn about the truth of the situation, and also learn about the animal rights movement in Palestine and veganism in Palestine, and come and see us while you're here. And the Buddhist chef was like, no, I don't have time for that. But, he probably didn't have time for that because
Yeah.
I'm sure that Israel was controlling, is Vive Israel
Right.
was controlling their every move. And God knows they never would have allowed that. Yeah.
Totally. They would have, Vibe Israel would have never been down.
And that should have been a sign right there. Maybe something
Yeah.
is not quite right about this situation.
Yeah, I really feel like
Yeah.
vegan washing has been an issue for a long time. I think it's very harmful to the vegan movement from an outside perspective. People who already think that veganism, has certain issues of
Mm-hmm.
like racism and sexism within the movement, to now have this image that is
Right.
so closely associated
Oh, yeah.
with Israel as a progressive vegan nation. And I really feel like this Vibe Israel tour,
Right.
it gave like steroids to vegan washing. It really, I mean, if you're on Instagram at all, like there's a good chance that you follow one of these people. These people have a collective reach of over 1 million people. I mean, I'm sure some of their followers overlap, so that might be a false number, but they have a combined following that is huge, and that spans people who look at blogs, people who watch YouTube, and people who follow Instagram. It's really
right.
They're all over the place, and yeah, Vibe Israel knows what it's doing. Like, they clearly picked,
right,
4 white people who seemed incredibly sweet, are very like good looking, are very like do not know what's going on, and they preyed on them. And I
Mm-hmm.
already knew, yeah, vegan birthright is bad. Yeah, the vegan
Mm-hmm.
army is bad. Yeah, there's a lot of pro-Israeli advertising in the vegan movement, but this just normalized it so much more. There were so many comments when I was looking through the feed of like, I can't wait to visit Israel. Like, wow, Israel is so amazing. Like, go Tel Aviv. Like,
Right.
10% of people are vegan. It was
Yeah.
I don't know. And I really think it's so important to get this message out
Oh, yeah.
because at least, Vibe Vegan or whatever it's called is going to keep on offering these trips, but I hope that creators in the future like that this
Yeah.
gets a big enough reaction and I'm not that optimistic because I haven't seen that big of a reaction, but that it gets some sort of reaction so that at least bloggers
Absolutely.
know that by accepting this sort of trip, this is what they're signing on to and that they should expect some pushback.
Right.
Because I really think like Caitlin, for example, in her message said she had no idea of the situation and she really didn't think that she was going to get pushback for going there. And I just hope that no one else is in that situation in the future.
Yeah, they're so manipulative and sneaky and sinister about the way they go about it. I could completely understand being in her position, not knowing,
Mhm.
and oh my God, somebody's offering me a free trip, Oh, I'll totally take that. And it's veganism, and I believe in veganism so strongly, and how wonderful, and I'm going to learn about a whole new culture. And yeah, of course, how would they know? They wouldn't know. It's like that old adage about, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Right, right.
But yeah, they wouldn't know.
Yeah. I do just want to ask you why it's important for vegans to talk about this issue and why it's fundamental, even if you just care about humans, or even, I mean, sorry, even if you just care about animals and animal rights, like why it is so important for vegans to condemn the Israeli occupation and recognize it as such and talk about it. Like, what does this have to do with intersectionality and why is it important for us to care? Because actually, quickly, one comment that I've heard a lot lately is that people who denounce Israel, like Israel is so small and it's just so
Hmm.
ridiculous to pick on them, and it's actually being used by people, like it's being used as a way to be divisive, to get like the left to focus on Israel when Israel is like
Yeah,
such a
you're right.
distraction from the real issues that are going on. So how would you respond to someone who says that within the vegan movement, that pointing a finger to the vegans that are going to Israel as a part of Brand Israel, you're being divisive by pointing that out because in the end, this is helping the vegan message.
Well, I mean, of course, this goes back to the same old thing that, we've been going round and round and round in the vegan movement of if you play with racists, if you play with
Mm-hmm.
fascists, if you play with misogynists, etc., 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 you are going to alienate
Mm-hmm.
a large part of the world. Like humans that you want to go vegan will not
Mm-hmm.
want anything to do with your movement because it will be full of toxicity to them. And that's like such a disgusting reason to support human rights that I really don't even like
Mm-hmm.
making that argument. But if you're really like that
Mm-hmm.
nihilistic that
Mm-hmm.
you just have no heart for human suffering at all, there's your argument. I mean, what else can I really say about that? But something I wanted to address about the issue of intersectionality. So this is very interesting that you bring up intersectionality because something I wanted to bring up in this interview is that Israelis, Zionists, I should say, Brand Israel, etc., they have really,
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to figure out how to manipulate intersectionality to their advantage. Just like they try to manipulate everything progressive to their advantage. And it's very interesting because a while back, I started thinking about this issue in terms of intersectionality. And I
Mm-hmm.
was thinking about it in terms of, well, we need to take a more pro intersectional stance towards Palestinian solidarity activism because actually a lot of the Palestinian solidarity movement doesn't really necessarily take that stance. And I was thinking, we really need to do that. And, use the lessons of intersectionality to reach more people about Palestine. Oh, you believe in feminism? Well, guess what? There are Palestinian women and femme people that are suffering. So no, you can't be a Zionist and a feminist.
Mm-hmm.
You believe in LGBTQ rights? Same thing. There are Palestinians that are, that have those multiple identities, et cetera, et cetera. And as it turns out, actually, I was not the only one who had this idea, because then I found out that Israel was panicking because they found out that this is what was happening on college campuses, that Palestinian solidarity activists were reaching out to other social justice movements and saying, look, this is how our issue intersects with yours. Let's join our struggles. And so Israel basically wants in on this action. And so now they are trying to essentially appropriate intersectionality, just like they've done with veganism, just like they've done with environmentalism, just like they've done with LGBTQ rights, just like they've done with environmentalism and feminism. I mean, and as I've said before, even really going all the way back to their founding, just as they've done with the history of Jewish suffering and resistance against anti-Semitism.
Right.
It really all starts there. But they have made a habit out of appropriating struggles for justice. And so what are they doing now? Oh, they're promoting the Jews as the true indigenous people of that land. And so therefore, if you believe in decolonization and indigenous people's rights, you should support Israel, not Palestine. They actually had the nerve, or should I say chutzpah, which is nerve in Yiddish. They actually had the nerve to create a poster. This was on the Columbia University campus, and they created this poster where they showed a First Nations person from what is now, U.S. occupied Turtle Island. They showed that image with the word Judah underneath, and Judah was the name of one of the two kingdoms or provinces that you want to call it of the original kingdom of Israel in biblical times. So they actually were, again, this association of we are the true indigenous people, but appropriating First Nations person's image for that message. And then, the other thing that they are trying to manipulate, which is so horrifying, is for all these years, from the very beginning of their founding as a nation, they have always shunned and eschewed and basically just distanced themselves from Jews of color. Because they didn't want that image. They felt that it was going to tarnish their image. Again, they were trying to conform to these European ideals. And there has always been a racial hierarchy, even amongst Jews in Israel, with Ashkenazi European Jews at the top, Mizrahi Jews and Sephardic Jews, which are the North African and Middle Eastern Jews in the middle, and African Jews at the bottom. And now all of a sudden, because it's hip and trendy to center people of color's voices, now all of a sudden it's, we're going to find Jews of color who support Zionism and center them so that it looks like, oh, well, if you don't support Zionism, you will be against them having a safe haven. Because we know that they're persecuted in the world. The Ashkenazi European Jew doesn't have that image so much anymore. So we have to find somebody else to kind of promote in that way.
Like a token oppressed person to make you
tokenizing them to the ultimate in support of colonialism. So, intersectionality is a very interesting, important point. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention that I just remembered what I was trying to hold on to and then I forgot before. So, you mentioned the comments in response to this vegan vibe tour. And when I heard about this, I went to the Buddhist chef's Facebook page. And of course, I left a comment that was pretty upset about him going on this tour. And there were lots of other people that were leaving angry comments. But there were a lot of supportive comments that were very creepily worded exactly the same in commenter after commenter after commenter after commenter. And it was something to the effect of, enjoy. And Israel is not just the global center of veganism. We also have many other cuisines for your dining pleasure or something like that.
Oh, wow. So it was like a bot?
Yes, and it was really creepy as well because I guess whoever had created the original statement probably wasn't a native English speaker because they put the word for in kind of like an unusual place that it wouldn't normally be. And every single one of them
Wow.
repeated that same mistake,
Ugh.
that same word in that same position over and over and over. Now, it came out a couple of years ago. USA Today covered it, and I know some other mainstream media outlets covered it. Obviously, they didn't, make it front page news, but there has been some mainstream media coverage that Israel, the government, is actually hiring people to post comments on social media to make Israel look good. And it was very obvious, and I was not the only one who noticed it. Lots of people were saying it, that that's what was going on in this case.
Yeah, I've heard that there's so many, they have so many resources to like write automatic comments on basically anywhere that the word Israel is mentioned.
Right.
Yeah, that's scary. And so the Buddhist chef, you don't think he did anything about that?
No, in fact, he was deleting the comments that were in support of Palestine that were criticizing him.
Oh, interesting. I know that Caitlyn didn't delete any comments, or at least she made a point of saying that.
Right.
I really feel like from everything I've seen from her, it's like, I don't think there was any ill intent, but
No, I don't either.
What would be amazing is if she realized what was going on and then spoke out against Five Israel.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about what's going on there right now, just kind of to seal up the interview? And I realize we maybe should have done this in the beginning, but I really think a lot of people aren't aware the extent to which it's important to talk about it and the extent of like the absolute horror that is going on right now and for the past, decades.
Yeah. Yeah. I really didn't talk about it, and I'm so glad you brought that up because there's so much to cover, and I really do need to talk about that. So basically, first of all, as I mentioned before, in addition to everything that they're doing in the West Bank, so that's where the apartheid settlements are, and of course they are militarily occupied, and that's where Hebron was that I spoke about before. But in addition to everything they're doing there, of course, in Gaza, they are completely blocking Gaza off to the outside world. Gazans cannot get in and out at all without Israeli permission. In fact, my friend, his father needs surgery for cancer, for colon cancer, and they were going to take the father to Jerusalem to have the surgery, and the Israeli said, no, you can't go. So now they are stuck doing the surgery in Gaza because they can't get out of there. So just in the past week, I got messages from my friends in Gaza saying that that Israel was bombing them again. This happens just like intermittently on an ongoing basis. Gazans have been living there. Again, the Israelis block them from getting food. They block them from getting medicine. Another thing, they still haven't recovered from the Israeli bombing of 2014. They basically demolished practically everything standing in Gaza, and then they blocked them from importing building materials so that they could rebuild their buildings. So it's like a big pile of rubble still. And the other thing is that they bombed their one and only nuclear power plant, and they have had no. So this has been since 2014. They've had limited electricity, but the Israelis were rationing it up until the past year. And then they cut their electricity rations to 4 hours a day. This has been so horrific that Gaza, which of course it's a desert, so they have very extreme temperatures, very cold in the winter, very hot in the summer. You have babies dying from exposure to the temperatures. And I have to say that, as I said, I've been a really serious activist for Palestine for the last 10 years, and I have never seen the situation like it is now. Never. I mean,
really?
Oh yeah, no. Like I have all these friends in Gaza that I have known for years, And normally they'll message me and they'll be like, oh, hello, how are you? Blah, blah, blah. And in the last year or so, it's just been like, we're desperate, we're starving. We have no money for anything. Please, please send us help. This is not like them. This is shocking what's going on there now. And it just makes it like such an obscenity that you look at that situation and then you look at a food tour of Israel. Like people are literally starving just a few miles away in Gaza. The whole Israel and Palestine combined is like the size of New Jersey. So this is all just happening a couple of miles away. People are literally starving. Israel is intentionally imprisoning them and starving them. And then it's like, oh, vibes Israel, vegan vibes. And let's like show all this gorgeous food that we're going to gorge ourselves on. And it's just so sick and twisted and disturbing.
Yeah.
Anyway, this past weekend was the Palestinian holiday called Land Day, which is, of course, very significant in Palestine because it is about their land and the fact that it's been stolen from them. And so they had these massive protests. Protesters were completely unarmed, and they were protesting on the border between Gaza and Israel. And the Israeli military came out and they opened fire on them. And they killed 17 protesters and they injured over 1,000. I heard counts of anywhere from 1,000 to 1,600 people injured.
Oh my God.
It was so bad that my friend in Gaza is diabetic, and he didn't go to the protest because his health is not good enough, but he is type 1 diabetic, and he was having high blood sugar and he needed to go to the hospital. And then when he got there, he was turned away because they were like, we have so many injured people from these protests that we can't even see you.
God.
So that's what's going on there now.
And is this getting a lot of attention in the US?
I was just about to bring that up.
And I'm pretending we did not talk about this 2 days ago.
Right, because of course in the US it's like, oh, there were clashes between Palestinians and Israelis.
Clashes.
On the border between Gaza and Israel. But I have to say the Washington Post actually ran an article just today that was like very condemnatory of Israel. And it was like, this is ridiculous. We can't keep supporting them like this. We need to really get tough on them. And I was like, oh, that's the Washington Post. That's pretty good that they published that.
How is the New York Times coverage of all of this these days? Because there was a moment where it was real bad.
Yeah, the New York Times has always been very, very heavily Zionist influenced. But even the New York Times, there are things that come out in the New York Times. But again, you have to kind of like catch them because they're not the stories that they promote. It's like, oh, one little article in the back, and, if you don't catch it, it's gone, then they don't speak about it again. But like the New York Times, for example, had an article on pinkwashing.
Oh, okay.
So they do talk about this stuff. They just kind of underplay it. So you don't really, if you're not really paying attention, you're going to miss it.
Oh, could you talk about the vegan products that people who want to support BDS should avoid buying?
Yes. So thank you so much for asking about that. So yeah, very important. First of all, we know how much vegans love hummus.
I mean, I am guilty of that myself, I must say.
I mean, I am just like, hummus is like a daily staple.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
A day without hummus is not a good day in the Marine household.
Right, exactly. It's like a day without hummus for a vegan is like, I don't know,
it's
a day without
like pretty devastating.
Yeah, so 2 very important hummus brands to not support, Sabra and Tribe. Sabra is actually funding the Hebron settlements that I talked about earlier, the ones where Palestinian children can't walk by without Israeli military accompaniment because the settlers will come out and physically assault them. that's what Sabra is funding. So if you are buying Sabra, you are supporting them, supporting that. So definitely don't buy Sabra. And Tribe is supporting the Israeli military Golani Brigade.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you don't want to be supporting either of those. They're really, really bad. It's much worse than even just supporting an Israeli brand because they're actually funding key aspects of the occupation. And we have a saying, don't support Israeli apartheid, boycott Sabra and Tribe. So if you just think about it that way, it's very easy to remember those two brands. Another thing, of course, medjool dates we love, right? In the vegan community for sweetening things. I see medjool dates in like all these recipes. Yeah, if you buy the ones now, they have medjool dates from like other parts of the world.
They
like,
do. They have some from like California, I think, and they have some from, oh no, Tunisia is another kind of date,
is another one. Oh yeah, right.
right?
Right.
Kind of date.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
So, it's fine to buy medjool dates, just make sure of where they come from. So, you want to look and see if they say Israel, obviously avoid it. Even if they don't say Israel, there's a barcode that starts with 729.
Mm-hmm.
That's an indication that it was made in Israel. Especially what you want to avoid is products that were not just made in Israel, but actually made in the Israeli occupied West Bank, because that means they're directly stealing those resources. They're exploiting Palestinian labor. It's very often the settlements, are making the products. They're the worst.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to be careful about that. SodaStream is another one. SodaStream has a factory in the Israeli occupied Palestinian West Bank. Another one is Ahava Beauty Products.
Yes.
That's a really big one as well. And I know a lot of these beauty products are like, oh, we're vegan and we're cruelty free, haha. And, all this crap. Say Yes to Carrots is another Israeli brand.
Do you have any updates on Ben and Jerry's? Because I know they were.
Oh, yes. And oh my God, thank you for reminding me. Ben and Jerry's is a huge one.
Is it really? Because I know that they had like one shop in, I think, the West Bank, but then I didn't know if that was still relevant, and I was maybe spreading fake news by saying that they were still there. Yeah.
No, Ben and Jerry's. Yeah, Ben and
Okay.
Jerry's is definitely selling to the settlements in the West Bank. So yes, there is an official boycott specifically against Ben and Jerry's, which of course, is vegan ice cream. So
Right. And plus, the Vegan Warrior Princesses attack did a
the chocolate, yeah.
Right. They did a petition to try and get Ben and Jerry's to disclose where they were obtaining their chocolate to put on the Food Empowerment Project's website of brands that source their chocolate ethically, if this was the case. And they never responded, or they responded with something. I forget. Yeah, no, I think they did respond, but basically their response was inadequate and signaled that they most probably did source their chocolate from West Africa, which sources 80% of its cacao from child slave labor.
Right.
So double reason not to support Ben and Jerry's, even if they do have vegan ice cream.
Yes, I know. And I know that's very disappointing. Nobody wants to hear that.
Well, the
But
thing is, like, France doesn't have any of these products, so a part of me is like, well, I really wish I could try Ben and Jerry's ice cream, but I
right,
don't for all these reasons, and I
right,
can't because I live here. So
right. Do they have any vegan ice cream in France? Is that even a thing there?
yeah, I mean, there's a store in Paris called Un Monde Vegan, a vegan world, and they have some ice cream
Uh-huh.
there. I think a lot of it is sorbet. I think they do, but it's like very niche, and you have to travel to this like one store in Paris to get it. So it's definitely not
Right.
something that you can get in the supermarket yet. Hopefully soon.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew Paris was not the most vegan friendly place.
Yeah, it's definitely way more vegan friendly than it was even 2 or 1 year ago, which,
Uh-huh.
is great and also makes me raise an eyebrow because obviously our food our
Mm,
food distribution is being more and more industrialized and sourced from literally all around the world. A
right,
few years ago, there's so many different products that you couldn't get here, and it was hard to obtain vegetables that were out of season, and that's just
right.
completely changed. So
Wow.
a part of me is,
Interesting.
yeah, it's good that there are more and more vegan products in supermarkets, but a part of me is also, especially when it's not French brands, when it's very clearly like
Yeah,
being imported from God knows where. But
yeah.
anyway, yeah. How about China? Because listeners, Laura lives in China, which is pretty cool.
Oh, yes. Actually, there's an amazing vegan movement that is really springing up in China, and it's been getting a lot of news coverage lately. Um,
Wow, cool.
because so the Chinese government has committed to actually reduce meat consumption by 50% by the year 2030
What? How is that not something vegans know?
because they don't like China. Well, white Western vegans, I should say.
Well, I feel like China's always singled out with India as like the people who are going to be 100% responsible of our meat production in the coming years.
Yeah, which is BS. That is
Really?
absolutely not true. So, oh my God. So, this is really exciting news. So, Forbes magazine, of all things, came out with an article this past week where they were saying that some extensive research has been done on populations all around the world, asking them about their meat consumption habits. And 70% of the global population said that they were either reducing or eliminating their meat consumption.
Okay, I need to get you on the show to talk about this again because even I had no idea.
Yeah, I was astounded when I heard that.
Wow.
I was like, this is the most exciting thing that I've ever heard. Like,
Right, because also I covered that, or I heard and spoke about it in a video that McDonald's is opening one restaurant every single day for the next 4 years in China, in rural China. And, sort of said, okay, well, our meat consumption at home may be decreasing, supposedly, but all of these multinational corporations are really preying on less developed areas to exponentially increase their meat distribution.
right. But that's not actually what's happening in China. What's happening in China is that basically there was a big sort of trend with, it was kind of like the quote unquote honeymoon period with American fast food. And so it seemed like that was just going up and up and up and up and up. And for a while it was. I mean, China was just obsessed with
Hmm.
McDonald's and
It's like
KFC.
it's a status symbol.
Right. But actually, it turned out that, basically it was just a trend and not a long term change. Because what's happened is that they've realized, number one, that it's unhealthy. And, China has that very ancient influence of Chinese medicine. That's not going away anytime soon. And they do look at health from a much more holistic perspective than Westerners. So when they realized that it was unhealthy and then also the environmental aspects to it, it fell out of fashion. And the funny thing, of course, is that with veganism becoming this sort of like big trendy thing in the West now, it's kind of like, oh, we'll jump on that trend as well.
Great.
Yeah, but at the same time, there's a very ancient vegan influence in China because of Buddhism. Actually, Chinese Buddhism Chinese veganism, goes all the way back through Buddhism. And it's very interesting because if you go to like the Buddhist temples, very often there will be a vegan shop nearby and vegan restaurants nearby, and you can get all kinds of vegan, like plant-based meat substitutes and all this sort of stuff. So that's really where the West got its ideas from to make those
Hmm.
things, was from China and from other countries that are Buddhist in East
Hmm.
Asia. So it's a very ancient influence, and it would only make sense. Plus, the other issue, of course, is that they are
Hmm.
mostly lactose intolerant. So dairy's
Hmm.
never been a part of the diet. So it makes sense that they would go. And also, the Chinese government, say what you will, the Chinese government in other respects, but they are really taking the climate issue very, very seriously. Uh, they have committed to reducing meat consumption by 50% by 2030. They have committed to changing over to renewable energy sources. I think they're investing $300 billion in clean renewable energy, solar, wind, etc.
Wow.
Even ocean, they're trying to harness the power of ocean movements for energy. They are building some kind of, I remember hearing that they were building some kind of like huge, I'd have to look this one up, but it was some kind of like huge food forest or something. They're really investing a lot of money into combating climate change in a way that the West is not, and certainly the US is not. So,
well, I was gonna say, is that why Donald Trump thinks it's a Chinese hoax?
yeah, right.
Interesting. Well, I'm very surprised to hear and learn about that, and very, very happy about it.
Yeah. So, don't believe the doomsayers. I mean, there's this whole thing, oh, well, there's no way that we can possibly have, we're going to go to a vegan world because it's rising and rising in India and China. Now, India is another story. I did look into India, and it does seem like meat consumption is rising there. So that's another issue. But China, which of course is almost a third of the world's population in one country, very different story.
Well, thank you so much, Laura, for recording this episode with me. And I know that Maxie is going to be so excited as well when I edit this episode and send it to her, because she's also very passionate about this issue. And we've talked many times about how we want to keep raising it on our platform, and that it's an issue that doesn't get a lot of attention in leftist circles or in vegan circles. I mean, certainly some leftists do talk about it. I know that Maxie notably is a huge fan of the podcast Media Roots. Have you heard of it?
I have heard of them, yeah.
With Abby Martin and Robbie Martin, and they talk extensively about the huge reach that the U.S. has in Israel and vice versa, and notably the huge reach of like the AIPAC Foreign Interest Lobby for Israel and in the United States. And so I know that she's always talking about that a lot as well. But yeah, so I unfortunately have to go to work. So we need to wrap up this discussion, but I'm sure that our listeners some of our listeners will really enjoy this episode. Some of our listeners are going to be pissed because that is what this issue does.
Yes, but some of them will be bots, so who cares? Some of them will be paid by the Israeli government to write angry comments, so whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. But thanks everyone for listening, and we'll put down in the show notes also all the places where you can reach Laura, notably through Facebook.
Something else I just want to mention is that the Palestinian Animal League is having the first pro-intersectional vegan conference in Palestine next month.
Are you going to that?
I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it. They invited me to
Oh my God, I want to go so badly.
Do you? We should talk about this after. But
okay, yeah, we should legit talk about this because it could be amazing.
Yes.
And I remember talking about this with you like 6 months ago, being like, we totally need to go, and now it's coming up. And
I know. So we'll have a conversation about it. But yes, so stay tuned because there will be more information coming out about that, and it's, I'm sure, going to be really incredible. They're actually looking at this issue from a decolonial context, looking at the land, looking at the ecology and the animal issue in that context of Israeli colonialism, and then, of course, the human rights issue as well.
That sounds amazing. I would learn so much.
Yes.
I would learn so much, and also how amazing would it be to get vegans with a platform to come and try to counter the vibe vegan bullshit that just happened.
Exactly. We could have our, vegan anti-Israel vibe.
I know. Well, they do have
Israel. So vegan Israel gives us a bad vibe to
Oh yeah. They do have literally 30 times the amount of subscribers that I have, but I'm still down to do whatever I can.
You have a following, and actually there is a Birthright Unplugged tour.
What is that?
Which is that sort of counterpart to the Birthright tour. So
that's a hilarious name, Birthright Unplugged.
Yeah, Birthright Unplugged. Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for listening, and I will see you in 2 weeks with Maxie.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Already know. She's